if you're watching us from the Americas, and welcome to the Diplocat Digital Global Debate, Public Diplomacy in Times of Pandemics. First of all, let me introduce this debate by giving a few words on what we do at Diplocat, the Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia. As you might know, at Diplocat, we specialize in public diplomacy. We build bridges between Catalonia and the rest of the world. We facilitate exchange of people, ideas, and projects. We do it with public diplomacy tools such as global debates like this one, where we work to provide ideas to the major European and global challenges. As an example, among the activities carried out last year, we organized a workshop on sustainable food systems and another one on the role of public diplomacy in the digital age. All our previous events had in common one thing. Major experts in their field of knowledge traveled from several points of Europe and the Americas to Barcelona for one intense workshop with more than 100 people sitting one next to the other under one very same roof for more than 4 hours. A situation which, due to the COVID-19 crisis, is hard to imagine nowadays in most cities and countries of the world. This health crisis has opened the door to a major economic and social crisis and to a new scenario with new health and safety measures that requires new tools to adapt as fast as possible. When confronted with these events, we don't want to fold our arms and wait. So what can we do to overcome the crisis? Can public diplomacy and its tools be of any help in the current context? Are there any magic new tools besides the internet that might help us to achieve our goals? This is the reason why we, like many others, have embraced the digital realm to organize today's global debate, to exchange some thoughts about the present of public diplomacy, but also about the immediate future and the worldwide recovery from the crisis. A future which will be conditioned by travel and social distance restrictions, for sure. However, it will also be influenced by how states, cities, sub-state entities, NGOs, and other international actors behave in the middle of the pandemic, both towards their own citizens and non-nationals who are under their jurisdiction in this unusual and unexpected context. This is why we will also debate today about the specific case of refugee management in a context of health crisis, as well as about how the management of crisis affects the reputation of countries at the international level. Because public diplomacy is based in promoting the image of a country and creating a positive public opinion abroad, which will directly affect the attractiveness of investments, knowledge, institutions, and people, while helping to establish and consolidate relations of friendship and trust with the rest of the world. Because in public diplomacy, reputation matters. In the unexpected world where we are now, for example, we learned a couple of days ago in the Korea Times that the COVID-19 pandemic has turned from disaster to opportunity for Korean public diplomacy. As Korean researcher at the World Health Organization, Ms. Ji Yong-mi said, this is due to the fact that a large number of confirmed cases detected by extensive testing adopted from an early stage of the outbreak in Korea was misinterpreted to the world as if Korea was not efficiently handling this crisis. Later on, it turned that Korea was doing things the right way. We're not only interested in how to transform our current actions into successful public diplomacy campaigns, we will also discuss about the future of face-to-face events. What is the future of, for instance, cultural and scientific exchanges? It was Steve Jobs, co-founder of a tech giant like Apple, who said that face-to-face meetings will never go out of style as creativity comes from spontaneous meetings. What now? Are we going to lose spontaneity and creativity? How can international actors react and readapt public diplomacy from now on? And more important, can public diplomacy find a way to help people feel more connected in a time of isolation? To discuss about that, today we have with us three relevant speakers who will provide very interesting insights to this context. Connecting from the USA West Coast, where it is now the early hours of the morning, Mr. Neil Simon, Vice President of Bighorn Communications and currently the team leader for the EU Policy and Outreach Partnership in the USA, a role he has held since the project's inception in 2016. Mr. Simon is an award-winning multimedia journalist and former communications director for the US Helsinki Commission and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly. He has also led senior parliamentary diplomacy training on behalf of USAID in Vietnam and published many articles on public diplomacy across Europe and Central Asia. Neil, thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure.
We're also excited to have with us Ms. Liz Galvez, a senior diplomat with the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office for 33 years. After retiring, Ms. Galvez was appointed the first executive director of the Aspen Institute, Romania, which she set up and managed for 3 years. Since 2009, she has been a course lecturer with Diplo Foundation, specializing in public diplomacy and negotiation skills, and was recently made a senior fellow of the faculty. Liz, thank you for joining us. And last but not least, connecting from Budapest in Hungary, we have also Ms. Montserrat Feixas. Ms. Feixas has been United Nations Refugee Agency's regional representative in Central Europe since July 2013. She's responsible for the coordination and management of the agency's operations in Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Moldova, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. She is also a member of the Advisory Council of Diplocat. Ms. Feixas will offer us her insights on the specific case of refugee management in a context of health crisis. Montserrat, thank you to take part in this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me.
With participants being introduced and before giving the floor to the speakers, please remember you can send your comments and contributions as well as ask your questions to the speakers for the second part of the debate, either through the YouTube live chat or on Twitter with the hashtag public diplomacy. Please feel free to do so. At this point, I would like to start with the first round of questions. Neil, let's start with you. As I said, public diplomacy is very much based on contact among people through face-to-face tools such as cultural exchanges or international visitor programs. In your opinion, how do social distancing and travel restrictions affect these traditional tools? Do you think this online-led public diplomacy is a temporary solution to the situation, or has it come to stay?
Well, we're obviously going to be living with the virus for quite some time. So a lot of what we're doing now, I do think is going to have at least an important element of all of our medium-term planning for the next 12 months. I do think it inspires creativity to try to do new digital engagements, new virtual events, and other creative ways that I think some embassies, delegations, and public diplomacy practitioners have maybe thought about, but they shied away from because it was riskier than doing what they already knew. So in that regard, that's a little bit of the silver lining to where we are with public diplomacy today, because it's no longer a creative luxury. It is a mandate. If you're going to actually fill up your public diplomacy dance card, if you will, if you're going to fill up your calendar, you need to be doing virtual engagements like this one. And thank you so much for hosting this. So I think it's important that people look at that. I was advising an ambassador's team recently about a situation where if you think of public diplomacy as our core relationships between our people, and we think of those we want to engage with as being a family member, if I told my mother, you know what, we got this virus, it's going to be tough to connect. have a great birthday, have a great Mother's Day, have a great holiday. Maybe in 2021, we'll get together again. Love you. I don't think she'd appreciate that so much. We should think of our interlocutors internationally in that same familial, friendly way. These are people that we care about connecting with. So we need to find ways to really build up different times throughout the year, at least quarterly, with those key stakeholders that you want to engage, your key audiences that you want to reach. You can't throw up your hands and say, well, COVID-19, there goes 2020. You've got to find ways to engage. So happy to talk in more detail as the discussion goes on about some of the specific ways that I've been advising my clients to do that, and different embassies and different businesses to be able to make sure that they're staying out front with their public engagement. But for the most part, I think I'll kick off the discussion just by leaving it there.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much. Let's move to Liz now. You said in a recent article that states will be judged in the future for their behavior towards their own citizens and with each other. According to you, Liz, how the way states behave towards their own citizens in times of pandemics affects their international image and public diplomacy campaigns afterwards?
Well, we know already that reputation is important for almost every state nowadays, and that people are investing, governments are investing huge amounts of resources in public diplomacy and nation branding, so it's clearly important. Soft power is a key ingredient if you're trying to promote a healthy economy at home and boosting your state's profile and influence in international affairs, whether it's business, education, tourism, political values on which your society functions. They need to inspire trust and confidence abroad. But you have to have trust and confidence at home first, otherwise it's simply not credible. I think it's fair to say that few governments have actually emerged from this particular pandemic, and it's far from over, by the way, with glowing reputations. We could probably count them on one hand, to be honest. I think top of the list is New Zealand. They had a decisive leadership. They took immediate action. They treated the population with empathy, which is important, while being very honest about these social and economic consequences. They made the population a partner in what they were doing. As a result, I think New Zealand now tops most opinion polls when it comes to approval ratings, closely followed by South Korea, which you mentioned, Laura, that is, they have been very successful and they have inspired confidence at home and abroad. And Taiwan, of course, although few states actually recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state, but they have won plaudits for what they have done. Some countries, on the other hand, they have taken decisive action, but they haven't really involved their population at all, and they haven't really allowed them a voice in commenting or discussing the impact or commenting on policies. Indeed, in some cases, questioning policies has been discouraged or even punished. There have been doubts maybe about the veracity of the data that's published. Empathy is a trait that hasn't really been visible. In some cases, the treatment of the more vulnerable members of the community, whether it's the poor, the homeless, the elderly, has been shameful in some cases. And then we've seen racism in a number of countries where governments have not really stood up and tried to calm down conspiracy theories, which have been targeting economic migrant workers or ethnic minorities. None of this is a recipe, in my view, for actually creating trust and confidence abroad. Likewise, of course, there are states which have been using the pandemic to introduce measures which are maybe abusing human rights, which are curtailing the political system, advancing a nationalist agenda. These are all the perceptions left by this type of action abroad is, on the whole, fairly negative. You have countries, very few, fortunately, who've dismissed the virus as insignificant and have taken no effective action, which I think is disrespectful and uncaring, shows an uncaring attitude towards their citizens. So what we end up with is corona chaos, politically divided populace, and a rejection of multilateral approaches in those cases, none of which are designed to inspire confidence and trust. Now, when it comes to the Europeans, they of course have taken measures to control the pandemic, and they have, as a rule, been transparent. They have thrown data at the populace. They've invoked scientists. The problem is that the variety and the strength of the measures that they have introduced are just bewilderingly different. Whether you close borders, open borders, quarantine, no quarantine, masks, no masks, there's no consistency in approach by European governments, and yet the European governments are supposed to be working in collaboration closely, and of course the European Union states are expected to act in concert with each other. This hasn't actually happened. In some countries, you don't even have the same policies applying to all parts of the country. In the UK, we have 4 policies for the different nations of the UK. So England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, all have different policies. Very confusing if you live anywhere near the border between them. When it comes to Europe, well, not just Europe, we saw this unseemly competition to get hold of medical supplies. There wasn't any evidence that countries were working together. And we've seen the same thing with economic mitigation. We look at the EU, there was a lot of resistance to begin with to setting up an economic rescue package for the most affected states. Now, this is not a good advertisement for the European Union project, nor is it the way for Europe to show that it's ready to take on the global leadership that the US appears to have renounced, although we hope that that's not the case. So what should states do now to repair these damaged reputations? And where should they focus their public diplomacy initiatives? Well, there's no blanket solution. Clearly, some states are not particularly bothered by a negative public opinion. If they're large enough or wealthy enough, they simply don't mind. But for, say, Europeans, Western countries, governments have been promoting themselves for years as responsible economic partners, as advocates of the rule of law and good governance and human rights, as global contributors to the global good. So they need to dispel this image of chaotic or inconsistent crisis management, where politics and policies might change from week to week or month to month. And they need to practice what they've been preaching for years. Now, the problem is that in this kind of crisis, citizens are very inward looking. You know, they're more focused on what's happening at home. They're not particularly interested in what's happening elsewhere. They will notice if a country is managing the crisis better or worse than them. But what they want from their own governments is decisive leadership, empathy, and remedies for the situation, and not just short-term stopgap remedies, but long-term remedies. And this is where I think that they're going to have to focus on that and then craft their public diplomacy strategies around that. Democratic governments have this challenge of having to manage immediate domestic demands, but at the same time maintaining or reviving a positive profile abroad in a way that's going to advance more longer term political and economic interests. Now, I don't think a glossy PR campaign is going to achieve that, nor will one-off cases of donations. I think but I do agree with Neil that you have to carry on planning as usual, maintaining your relationships, reinforcing them, looking out new economic opportunities, partnerships, rebuilding your tourism. The danger, of course, is if you focus too much on that, you might give the impression of being tone deaf if you're operating in countries which are still struggling. So you have to maintain a balance. Now, I will conclude just with a quotation from a recent interview given by Angela Merkel, which I'm sure that you've seen. She said, "Europe is not yet sufficiently resistant to crises. The Euro crisis in 2008, the refugee crisis in 2015, and now the coronavirus pandemic. I expect each of us always to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and consider problems from their point of view. If Europe wants to be heard, then it needs to set a good example." And I think that the policies that Europeans take from now and the midterm, because with this pandemic, the effects will carry on for a long time, then they need to create the policies and then create the strategies that fit those policies.
Thank you very much, Liz, for this very interesting approach as well. And now let's go to a more specific view on the crisis. And let's move to Montserrat. We'll talk now about your field of expertise, which now Liz also mentioned in this quotation, mentioning this 2015 refugee crisis. So, Montserrat, you have been working for a long time on humanitarian crises in Central European countries. Could you give us your opinion on what is the importance of public diplomacy when it comes to influence on the management of humanitarian or health crises? Do you think that the two kinds of crises have points in common?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to start actually by quoting some figures. 1% of humanity is actually right now forced to be displaced. That means 79.5 million people. Of these, half of them are children. 24 million are refugees. 4 million are asylum seekers. Last year, close to 2,000 people died in trying to cross the Mediterranean to reach safety and a better future in Europe. This year, over 300 people have died in trying to do so. Those are the facts. And in UNHCR, our purpose is to make sure that the right to seek asylum is respected, that everyone has the right to seek asylum. We want to make sure that the well-being of refugees is ensured. And in order to do that, we have to use public diplomacy, because our purpose is that to make sure that people do not just hear figures, but behind the figures, that they see the people. They realize that for every figure, there is someone, a person who has suffered, who deserves compassion, and somebody who requires and deserves our support. So we engage very much in public diplomacy, and we do so around 3 areas. The first one, I would say, is about the narrative. We want to make sure that we speak up timely, that we say the right thing, that we are knowledgeable, that we have the right expertise, and that we do so at the right time. The second area is about empathy. We want to generate empathy. We want people to understand that we are talking about people. We want them to have compassion towards the refugees and the asylum seekers. And also, we want to address often fears and misperceptions that are quite abundant among the public. So that is very important. And the third area for our public diplomacy is about action. We want to get people to act. We want to encourage them to act. We want to encourage countries to do the right thing. We want governments to adopt the right policies. So it's all about public diplomacy, and it is about ensuring that people recognize the gravity and the scale of forced displacement, that people care about the people who are forced to move, against their will, and that people also take action, and they take action themselves, and that they prompt others to take action to do the right thing for refugees. Now, how we do that? Well, we do that by identifying, I would say, the right messages and tailoring them to the audience that we are facing. And our audience is first and foremost the public, but here I think it's important to distinguish that on the one hand, we have the supporters, people who are convinced that it is the right thing to support refugees because they think that it reflects the values of society to do so. But next to them, we have the conflicted middle, let's say, many people who may have compassion for refugees, but who at the same time are very concerned about their well-being. They're concerned about the impact of refugees on their well-being, on society, on their culture, on the economy, on their safety. And it's important to address those fears. And I have to say that this conflicted middle right now are the majority in Europe, hence extremely important. Another audience, also very important for us, is the media, because of course the media has the power to reach a vast audience. So it's very important for us to engage with them. And I would say, last but not least, governments, because governments are the ones who make policy. So the policymakers are an extremely important audience for us. We engage very closely with them to try to make sure that they abide by international law and they abide by their obligations. So that is, I would say, the core of why we engage in public diplomacy. Now, you mentioned the COVID-19 and the impact between our work, the impact on refugees. I think that we cannot overemphasize enough the seriousness of this pandemic. As we are speaking, more than 10 million people have been infected. More than 500,000 people have died because of the virus. And among them, there are people who flee war and conflict, who flee persecution, refugees and asylum seekers. So it is of direct concern to us. Now, when the pandemic started in Europe, states adopted very stringent measures, including some that involved closing of borders. And they were extremely legitimate because we understood that their first concern was to protect the people on their territory. So we were supportive of that. At the same time, our concern was to make sure that when doing so, they would still respect the right to seek asylum, as well as the well-being of refugees. So we engaged again in public diplomacy with them, trying to persuade governments, and we tried to offer very concrete advice and very concrete recommendations how they could ensure the protection of their citizens, of the people of their countries, while at the same time making sure that whoever knocked on their door asking for asylum would be able to do so. So that was very important. Another aspect was also to make sure that whatever programs were put in place to support the population would not exclude refugees and asylum seekers. We wanted to make sure that there would be no discrimination towards them simply because they were not citizens. And we wanted to make sure that, whatever was done for once, they would also be able to benefit from that. Another important part of our public diplomacy has been, in connection with the pandemic, to support all the public health efforts of governments. We know that we are, in a way, in a privileged position in terms of communication with refugees and asylum seekers. So we have worked very hard to make sure that refugees and asylum seekers were able to access actual, updated, and I would say accurate information so that they could protect themselves, they could protect their families and their communities, but also that they could contribute to the efforts in the countries, to fight the pandemic. And that has been extremely important. And yet a third element of our public diplomacy has been to, I would say, spread the message among the general public that refugees are people like you, like me, and that they deserve our support, and also to understand that facing the virus, it makes no difference whether you are a refugee or not, or whether you come from, because the virus does not discriminate. And including refugees and asylum seekers makes sense also from a public health perspective. Now, you also asked me about the differences between this crisis and the 2015 crisis. I would say that from our perspective, in terms of the principles, there is no difference, in the sense that what drives us is this commitment to ensure that the right to seek asylum is respected, then and now, no difference there. And that there's no discrimination about refugees or between refugees and the rest of the population. What has been different, I would say, is that maybe at the time, in 2015, there was more emphasis on figures. I think that the media was very, very keen on portraying this massive arrival of people, focusing more on numbers rather than on the persons behind the numbers. Whereas now, I think that there is a great understanding that truly the virus does not discriminate, that we are in this together. And I think that both the governments and the public have understood that. And there has been, I would say, it's been a little of an easier task that way for us. An important element also has been that we do have many refugees and asylum seekers who have a medical profile, and they have very actively contributed, in the effort to fight the pandemic. And of course, that has been a huge asset for our public diplomacy.
Thank you very much, Montserrat. Thank you so much for all your contributions. Very inspiring answers so far. And let's move now to the second round of questions, where I'd like to ask the same question to you all. Could you please tell me, from your own fields of work and knowledge, in the current context, which public diplomacy practices will you highlight as best or worst cases, either for the outcomes achieved or due to their innovative nature? Liz has mentioned some cases in her first intervention. She mentioned New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, but perhaps somebody else would like to highlight other cases. And if not, perhaps Liz, you can also comment a little bit more on this very interesting question that you the fact that the EU has not achieved this single voice once more in the middle of the crisis. So this is just to give another idea to comment on. Neil, let's start with you again.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for your comments, Liz and Montserrat. Really appreciate hearing from you, Montserrat, especially about the power of people to drive our narratives and to tell our stories and to get us out of, especially in a public health crisis or a refugee crisis. We see massive numbers and they don't make sense to us until we attach faces to them. So I think that's very important. And I think that when you hold up New Zealand and South Korea for their leadership example, Liz, I think you're spot on. When you do something well, you have a responsibility to share it with the world because people can learn from you. This is like the raison d'etre of public diplomacy, that we aren't just connecting to connect, but we're connecting to help each other be better at governing our countries, at living our lives, at having healthier communities. And so I think that while there may be we could discuss for hours about mistrust of multilateral institutions and how nationalistic regimes have sort of cut down trust in multilateral cooperation over the years. But I think that at their core, when people feel like, gosh, my community's doing less well than another community. If the US looks at their numbers of cases and then they compare themselves to how Europe has flattened their curve over the last month, there's people in the US who I don't think are saying, well, gosh, we're doing it great. You can't have that attitude when you're looking around and you're seeing more and more neighbors being infected with this terrible virus. And so at that point, there's an appetite. There's an appetite to learn from those who have done something better. And to, whether it's New Zealand or others, to say, well, actually in exactly 1 hour from now, the EU will be hosting a webinar about contact tracing apps and balancing, of course, the public health demand and need with privacy concerns of what apps are people comfortable with and what are different countries and states in the US doing to leverage health tech, med tech, to really help address concerns with COVID. And I think that, SAP in Germany could be, developing something great that's really useful. But if they keep it to themselves and they don't talk about it, globally on fora like this, then they're doing a disservice to global public health. If a country does something poorly or they violate people's expectations of privacy in a way that they don't like, they equally have a duty to say, you know what, we tried this, we thought it was a good thing for public health, but we really had a backlash from our citizenry, and you all could learn from that and not make the mistake that we did. This is where diplomacy, sister city collaborations, webinars, pairings are all really, really essential. And I think that to your initial question now on this round, Laura, I think that it's really important that we be proud of the successes that we have, but that we don't stop at, we really had a good interactive webinar. We got to do more creative things. On May 9th for Europe Day, the EU, not my idea, the EU delegation, the ambassador on down to the United States said, we want to do something special for May 9th that really brings Europe Day to the United States and showcases our transatlantic ties. And they could have done that with a webinar and had a smart panel discussion, but they really decided to really make it something extraordinary and did a 90-minute broadcast special. And in the course of 2 days, they got people like the head of Americas from Microsoft, Pete Buttigieg, the former presidential candidate, mayors of US cities, governors, departments of state officials, and they all shared not just a comment celebrating Europe Day, but a comment reflecting on the needs of the moment when it comes to public health, the concerns of the moment about COVID, but that deep appreciation that underlied it all, that we're here for each other, that we are stronger together, which was the name of this program. And to see tens of thousands of people engage with this content that was live on Facebook and live on YouTube, and then carried out through an extra social media campaign afterwards, where people could see various clips of celebrities, comedians, musicians from the EU and the US. It was a great way to see the EU flexing its creative muscle, flexing its ability to showcase its strong partnerships. And I think it's something that I know they're proud of. I know other embassies have reached out to them to say, hey, we want to do something like that for our national day. We want to do something like that for other topics. I've also seen a really good example from the binational trade chambers like Belcham and French American Chamber and the Spanish American Chamber, where they pooled their resources to do a series of pairings that they called the ripple, with the idea that when one person talks to somebody for even just 10 minutes, we can create that spontaneity that Laura mentioned, that Steve Jobs talked about, how the power of in-person connectivity. How do we surprise people? We can surprise people whenever we see them, but it's really hard in these virtual settings. So these binational chambers, they created a space where there was this round robins of discussions where every 10 minutes, literally your camera would turn off and then turn back on with someone else that you wanted to connect with. And you said, I want to connect with people who are interested in X topics, and I'm willing to connect with people who are interested in these topics. And the binational chambers paired people up, and we had this sort of fast roundtable speed dating type experience. And I think it was really valuable. And 75% of the people of the several, I think 3,000, I think that participated, 75% of the people said afterwards in a survey that they had a follow-up conversation with someone that they met through this, ripple. And so that's where you talk about not just having public diplomacy moments, but really magnifying those moments to build momentum. So a couple highlights from my last few weeks that I think are worth keeping in mind and seeing how we can replicate for other experiences.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much. So Liz, would you like to comment on that? Apart from the examples you gave us, the good experiences and best practices that you shared?
Well, first of all, I've got to apologize because I had a power cut here. So I've lost the last 15, 20 minutes of the discussion. So I may be saying things that other people have already said, for which I apologize. But I mean, I live in a rural area, and obviously dependable Wi-Fi is not on the agenda today. I think well, Neil mentioned this just now, but I think the most effective public diplomacy practices are those which go towards building up long-term relationships and networking. And what you want is a long-term impact, and that comes basically from relationships. I think there are three areas I would highlight as suitable for that. One is perhaps networking with elites. And you could have, for example, there have been a number of webinars with academics, think tanks. When these can be transferred online without too much difficulty, when people have organized conferences, they're normally limited by space to about 100 people. If you have it online, you could have 600 or more at these conferences. So you have a much wider audience. So your networking is wider. I've been to 3 in the past week, and I've developed new contacts through that. Then visit programs. I think when we've talked about inviting people. When you invite people for visits, obviously you can't invite them physically anymore because of constraints on travel and quarantine, etc. But it is possible. I think one of the Foreign Office ministers recently paid a virtual visit to Bangladesh. So his program was set up for him, but it was all done via conferencing apps. So he met a series of people as though he were there in person. This kind of thing can be done, and it is a way of reconnecting. But it needn't just be official. Another example, United Arab Emirates ambassador in London recently hosted a virtual dinner party for members of parliament. And it was they were a little uncomfortable to begin with until eating in front of each other on a screen. But after a short while, they became used to the format, and they were able to have the kind of conversation that they would have had if they were in his residence. So there are things that you can do using technology. Another area, which again, this is one that Neil mentioned, is the scientific exchanges. Generally, I think scientists are quite competitive if they're developing new products. But in this case, when search for a vaccine for corona, I think scientists can collaborate. They can do this online as well using technologies that are available to us now, and they can collaborate more closely. This could be done also perhaps with private sector manufacturing capabilities. And I know of one case in Chile where there's a collaboration on the coronavirus busting capabilities of copper, involving universities from different countries plus commercial mining corporations. So there are new collaborations and new relationships that you can build, making use of this situation. And then thirdly, on the cultural diplomacy, it is possible still to maintain interest in cultural diplomacy, still to project it, whether it's language training that can be conducted online. A lot of museums are already conducting virtual tours of their museums using virtual reality or augmented reality in some cases. I was invited recently to an online concert organized by the Romanian Cultural Institute in London. And you could either follow it live on Facebook or YouTube, or you could register to go on Zoom, and then you could actually physically applaud at the end so that the performer could feel the audience participation. So there's a lot of, this is all quite new. People are being, I think, fairly creative. And then I was also told recently, a Philippine tourism office in London organized a series of celebrity masterclasses, celebrity chef masterclasses, where one of their chefs would online give a cookery demonstration and demonstrating Filipino dishes. So these kind of things, I think, can be done. And you will at least keep maintaining interest in your country while you are getting the economy back on track. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you, Liz. And Montserrat, would you like to give us your opinion on that? And then we'll move to the questions from the audience.
Yes, yes, indeed. Can you see me? Because I'm not sure actually whether you can see me or not. Can you see me?
No. No.
I see you.
Are you willing? Are you willing to
I
share? Are you willing to share some
No.
data on the screen? No. Okay.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah.
Right.
Now I see.
So, yes, please. So you were asking me about my views on that. I think that maybe I should start by saying that we have been successful in ensuring non-discriminatory access to healthcare for everyone. So that is a positive thing. I think that when it comes to ensuring the right to seek asylum through the pandemic, it has been a little bit more complicated. I think that in some cases, some of the restrictions, we were able to make sure that they were for the shortest possible time. In some cases, these restrictions still persist, so we haven't been that successful. But I would say that in terms of public diplomacy, what are good, let's say, good practices, and I think that what we have learned that we want to keep also for the future is that by going digital in many ways, we have become in a way better able to reach out to many more people and many more places. As you mentioned, I actually work with 9 countries, and it's not always possible to be everywhere, whenever or as often as I would like. But by going digital, I'm now able to participate in events, online, that otherwise it would have taken days or maybe weeks to actually do. So that is very positive because it gives me an insight and it empowers me to act in a way that before it was not possible. So that I think is possible. It's positive. What is also positive is the fact that I think that this has allowed the empowerment of refugee networks. I think that it has allowed the creation of bridges between host community and refugees, the development of fora. We have refugee women fora in which also local people participate, and it has created a sense of community that maybe before was not possible, maybe because they were too busy, or they didn't have the time or the resources to travel from one city to another, or or maybe even from within one city. So that has been very, very positive. On the other hand, I think that let's not delude ourselves. Nothing beats the direct human contact. A few days ago, I was talking online with a refugee in Croatia, somebody who, after many trials, had been able to enter Croatia and seek asylum. And it was very, very nice to be able to see him and be with him, even though I'm sitting in Budapest and he was in Zagreb. But being there with him, feeling the emotion of his words, if I had been able to be just next to him, it was not the same. So much as we are developing good practices and we are making the best of the situation, I do hope that we'll be able to go back, at least in some areas, to the way things were before, so that we do not lose the human contact.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to you all for your very interesting and generous contributions. And I will propose now, since you already interacted a little bit with each other and you had some comments, some cross comments. We have quite a lot of contributions and questions from the audience. So if you don't have any further comments on your own contributions, we will move to the questions. So perhaps we can start by the first one. If you want, I can read all of them, and then we can have a round for the speakers, and each one picks the questions that are more specific to their field. Okay. Otherwise, we won't have time to answer all of them. So I'll start by a question by Teresa Carreras. What role is left for traditional diplomacy in this new context in comparison with public diplomacy? Is the new context more suitable for public diplomacy than for traditional diplomacy? Second question by Joan from Terrassa City Council. What do you think about the role of cities on public diplomacy, mostly related to global agendas? The third one is by Isidra Sala. He's the delegate of the government of Catalonia in the US. Great event, thanks. Question for Liz. COVID came unexpectedly, but can we learn some lessons from this pandemic to reinforce the global democracy via public diplomacy from future challenges? Another one from the Philippine Embassy of the United Kingdom. Hello, Stacey Garcia here from the Philippine Embassy in London. Question for Liz as well. How can we harness diaspora communities to be our partners in fighting the pandemic? Another one from Marianne Newman from New York City. And it's, might the speakers address the role of culture in public diplomacy? For example, offering art, literature, music produced by refugees to engage communities, and as Mr. Simon says, increase empathy, but not only refugees, public diplomacy in general. The sixth one, I'm Ximena Garcia, International Relations Consultant from Mexico City. As you guys said, the performance of every state managing the pandemic is going to affect their image worldwide. What do you think a state could do to avoid being stigmatized as the state who failed during the pandemic? I guess the strategy has to be case specific, but I will appreciate any ideas you have. What do you think a state could do to avoid being stigmatized as the state who failed during the pandemic? I guess the strategy has to be case specific, but I will appreciate any ideas you have. And last but not least, again, Magali Muria. Hello. Thank you for a great discussion. My question is, if in your experience, can we think about public diplomacy as a way to neutralize fake news and disinformation? If so, could you kindly share some insights? Well, these are some of the questions that we questions, and we'll have some comments so far. But wow. Perhaps I will recommend to do this final round of contributions from the speaker side. And if any of the questions is left to be answered, perhaps we can also contact the person who posted it afterwards and send an answer if you want. So Neil, let's move.
These are great questions. Thank you so much for such an engaged audience. I'll take a stab at a few of these and be really brief. First, I do think that the new context is more suitable to public diplomacy than traditional. I think that it was interesting to hear about this ambassador hosting a Zoom dinner party, but I think that that's by and large the exception, is from what I can tell. And I'm actually sensing from some ambassadors a degree of frustration because so much of what they do relies on that cajoling, those hallway conversations, the in-person negotiation that is just less suitable to a written word or something over a channel that feels less private. And as much as we believe in transparency, there's a role for those private conversations when we're having negotiations. So I do think public diplomacy gets its boost during this because it's like, well, let's do everything for everybody. It's online and it's available. So I think there's some things we can do on the traditional side, of course, to digital means. But I do think that by and large, the moment we're in today lends itself more towards the public diplomacy side. Role of cities, I think it's huge, especially in a public health pandemic. Having cities share their stories and share their leadership is essential. And I think it's similar for other programs. And I think embassies do themselves a disservice when they don't leverage mayors and city and regional leaders, because so much of the major challenges of our day come down to major urban area challenges, emissions related to transportation, mobility and your future of work related to jobs and technology. So much of this stuff is really taking place in our largest urban centers that then have ripple effects throughout the rest of the world. So I think that there's a huge role for cities and local public health agencies to leverage their story on the global stage. I think the role of culture, there's an opportunity here for doing some more tactile things, even though while we're in the digital environment. And what I have in mind for that is something that I've been recommending to a few clients, which is, your country, Philippines in a box, culture in a box. You could mail to your key stakeholders and amplifiers something that they literally open up. And then the digital experience is, just like the chef masterclass, it's a great example, but the digital experience is everyone opening their box at the same time. And, oh, I have this, and maybe it relates to something that you received. And so you're at least activating more senses than you otherwise could if you were just doing a webinar or a two-way over a computer. But now you've got something you can touch, smell, maybe taste, and you're activating those things that you would activate if you were together. And so you're bringing in culture in a new way. Virtual tours of museums, huge. Musical playlists and live events, huge. Leveraging of celebrity, always huge. So I think culture has a role in the environment we're in. It's a matter of just finding the proper way to channel it. On Mexico City's question about the stigma of countries who might have failed, I will just briefly say I think that there's always an opportunity to admit your faults, say when you've been wrong, and correct course. And those countries that improve their reputations out of this crisis will be the ones who start today and say, we're doing this now. Whatever we did yesterday, it got us to where we are, but we're doing this now. Does the US come out of this with a wholesale public health system? No, I doubt it. But you will see conversations of that bubble up and realize, well, gosh, if so many of these things are piecemeal in a country, how could we unify? So I think reputation is always a forward-looking how you recover from a crisis. Neutralizing fake news, similarly. Being aggressive with your social media team and your media relations team, just to give as much as you can to bat back stories, to share what you're doing positively, to spend money to amplify your messages online. Unfortunately, it's whack-a-mole. You're always going to be knocking down fake news stories. You're never going to get ahead of that. But as much as you can be more aggressive on your social channels, you've got to dispel myths and leverage celebrity to dispel myths. Seeing sports teams and others say you got to wear a mask is a great way to dispel myths of masks don't work or masks are an infringement on my rights.
Thank you. Liz. Yeah.
Thank you. I would just make a few points. Role of cities, well, non-state actors in general, I think is very important, but cities in particular, Neil has covered all of that quite comprehensively. I think not only now in management of the pandemic, but in the future when you have you have a lot of technology involved for transport systems, green cities, etc. There is a lot where cities can lead the way, where maybe it's maybe a step too far for the whole country. And then, of course, city-to-city diplomacy is very strong. You have twinning already exists in a number of countries. And this is person-to-person contact. It's not government-to-government. It's not official-to-official in that broader sense. So I think it's very important. The new context, what I wanted to say last time, I forgot, is that I think scholarship programs and education programs are suffering a little bit with the move to online at the moment, because people want the experience of being in the country, whether they're on scholarship or whether they're paying themselves. They want the full experience. They don't want to be stuck in a room having their lessons online. So there is a difficulty with that. And I think I read somewhere that in the UK, the universities are preparing for 80 to 100% of their international students deferring their studies in the coming year. Now that's a huge amount, and of course it's going to cost them millions. So it is difficult in that particular area, and it's an important area, obviously, for public diplomacy. Will we learn anything from this pandemic? Well, I sure hope so, really. And I hope that the one thing that we learn is that there needs to be a lot more multilateral cooperation. States who are proponents of multilateralism need to back that up with concrete action. Perhaps there will be more collaboration in other areas, whether it's manufacturing, essential equipment, sharing expertise, whatever it might be. I don't know that future challenges, I hope we don't have this again, but of course people are already talking about it coming back, this virus coming back this winter. Stacey, on the diaspora, one of the things I was going to say about the role of the diaspora is that they can be very helpful to support you in fighting fake news. If there are conspiracy theories about certain measures or certain countries, these are spread, of course, very easily on social media, but diaspora can be helpful because they will be in touch maybe with their mission, but they also have this huge network of friends and family back home. So that is one area where they can be helpful in fighting the pandemic. More broadly, of course, they do have a role in promoting culture and networks between countries, which I think is understood by everybody. And I just want to make one point about the stigma of doing something badly. If you apologize and say, I'm sorry, we got this wrong. We wanted to set up this tracing up. It didn't work. We're sorry. We are now going to do something that we think will work. Or we recommended that we do research in this area of vaccine. That hasn't worked. We're going to try something else. Just if states are honest, governments are honest about that, then that goes a long way to remove that stigma. It's where there is a denial that anything wrong has been done, that the wrong route has been taken, then that only exacerbates the negative perception. And then on the countering of fake news, of course, this spreads faster than anything that officials can put out. So it is very difficult, but you have to keep on, you need to have people monitoring this. I know that the EU has got a team monitoring fake news so that it can be countered very easily. But there's a difference between deliberately fake news, which is disinformation, which is designed to destabilize, or whether it is just rumors, that you can cure COVID with sunshine and bleach or whatever it might be. And those you will need to bring out the right kind of people to dispel those kind of myths and rumors. And celebrities is one way to do it. But I would just warn that there have been cases where celebrities have been guilty of actually propelling the fake news around the globe, or those who have huge numbers of followers. So you do have to pick the right kind of influencers that you're going to work in collaboration with.
Okay, Montserrat, it's time to be ending the debate, but perhaps you would like to add something as well?
Well, I think that the experts have spoken already, but just to say a few words about 3 points that I think have a connection between public diplomacy and refugees. One is about the role of the cities. The other one is about the culture. And the third one is about the fake news. I think that truly cities have a major role to play when it comes to public diplomacy, including in the area of refugees. Refugees are people who live like us, like all of us, and local government has a major role to play, especially in their integration and well-being, and in ensuring that they are part of the community. So by all means, I think that all the public diplomacy that can be done with the cities to that end is an absolute must. About culture, absolutely. I think that, public diplomacy in a way is as a major tool to present the refugees in terms of culture, not just as the recipients of aid, but also the ones, people who can give, people who come with the skills, with talents. Some of them are extremely gifted and they can share that. And I think that, public diplomacy is a tool that uses that to, I would say, create a better understanding about refugees. And it's a great asset. And finally, about the fake news, I think that, this is a never-ending battle. We know that right now there is a very toxic narrative against foreigners, against refugees, and it is a must that we use public diplomacy to fight it. And I would say that, to cap it all, and in terms of what have we learned from this pandemic, not just with regard to refugees, but also with regard to everyone, I think that we have learned that access to healthcare is a human right. It has been one of the Millennium Development Goals, healthcare for everyone. We are seeing that this is not true. We are seeing that across the world, access to healthcare varies greatly, depending on the country, and in some places also depending on the resources of the people there. That's unacceptable. I think that if we have learned something, is that truly it is a human right and everybody should have access to it.
Thank you very much, Montserrat. So in conclusion, to end the debate, I will say, and I guess that you all agree with that crises always represent a challenge in all fields, including the one of public diplomacy. However, I believe that reinventing things is part of human nature to survive, and we are all committed to doing so. So I want to thank you all for following us, and I would also like to especially thank the three speakers, Neil, Liz, and Montserrat. We are grateful for the time and effort you took to share your thoughts and experiences with us today. The debate has been extremely interesting and absolutely timely, so thank you very much for your contribution. I remind you all that the debate is already available in the Diplocat YouTube channel, and it will be shortly posted in our website in case you missed it or want to review it or spread it. So we hope you can join us again in other debates in the weeks to come. And in case you're interested in our activities, I invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or to follow us on Twitter, Catalonia PD, Instagram, Catalonia Public Diplomacy, and LinkedIn, Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia. Thank you very much.